I found the messages by accident. That's the thing that still gets me. People always imagine discoveries like that happening in dramatic ways, someone leaving a phone unlocked on purpose, a suspicious notification lighting up in the dark, some huge betrayal practically begging to be uncovered. But real life isn't like that. Real life is sitting cross-legged on your best friend's bedroom floor at 11:30 at night while he's in the shower, trying to find an old concert photo on his laptop because you're both drunk enough to feel nostalgic. That's all it was supposed to be. Bryce and I had known each other for 6 years by then, since freshman year of college. Same dorm building, same sarcastic sense of humor, same habit of staying awake until 3 in the morning talking about absolutely nothing. People used to joke that we acted like an old married couple. Bryce always laughed louder than I did when they said it. Trust me, he'd grin, throwing an arm over my shoulders. Dawson would kill me after 1 week. And I'd roll my eyes even though, secretly, I liked when he touched me casually like that. Like it meant nothing. Because for him, maybe it did. For me, it never really did. Not after the second year. That's when things changed for me, even if I pretended they hadn't. It happened slowly, quietly, the way these things always happen. I started noticing the details first. The way Bryce always looked for me in crowded rooms. The way his voice softened when it was just the two of us. The fact that he remembered tiny things about me that even I forgot sometimes. Like how I hated tomatoes unless they were cooked. Or that I got quiet when something was wrong, instead of angry. Or that I always cracked my knuckles when I was nervous. Nobody notices stuff like that unless they care. At least that's what I told myself. But Bryce dated girls constantly back then. Not seriously, usually. Just enough to keep everyone convinced they knew exactly who he was. And I let that convince me too. So I buried it. Buried the fact that my chest tightened whenever he introduced me as my boy. Buried the fact that every time he fell asleep on my couch during movie nights, I stayed awake longer than necessary just looking at him. Buried the fact that sometimes he looked at me in ways I didn't fully understand. And life moved on. Until the messages. Bryce's laptop was open on the bed while music played quietly through his speakers. I was halfway through scrolling old folders looking for pictures from some disastrous camping trip we took years ago when a notification appeared in the corner of the screen. Unknown number. You never answer my question. I should have ignored it. I know that. But something about it caught my attention immediately. Mostly because Bryce hated texting. Half the time he took 6 business days to answer me. Yet somehow this message had 3 previous notifications stacked under it. I clicked before I could stop myself. And immediately wished I hadn't. Not because it was scandalous. Because it was honest. The conversation was already open when I clicked the notification. Long paragraphs. Weeks of messages. And Bryce sounded different there. Softer. Unfiltered. Unknown number. Do you ever think about telling him? Bryce. All the time. My stomach dropped. I stared at the screen. Unknown number. Then why don't you? Bryce. Because losing him would destroy me. I stopped breathing for a second. My eyes moved automatically to the next message. Unknown number. You really think he'd leave? Bryce. If he knew the truth? Yeah, probably. The bathroom shower was still running. Steam hissed softly behind the closed door. And suddenly I felt like I was standing in the middle of someone else's life. I should have closed it. Instead, I kept reading. Bryce. I tried getting over it. Dating helps for a while. Then he smiles at me, and I'm screwed again. My chest physically hurt now. Unknown number. You've been in love with your best friend for 6 years. Maybe it's time to admit this isn't going away. 6 years. 6. I actually laughed under my breath when I read that part. Except it didn't sound amused. It sounded shaky. Because 6 years ago was exactly when everything changed for me too. The shower turned off. My heart nearly stopped. I slammed the laptop shut so fast I almost dropped it off the bed. A second later, Bryce walked out wearing gray sweatpants and rubbing a towel through his wet hair. You find the photos? He asked casually. I looked at him. Really looked at him. And suddenly, every memory I had of him felt different. Every glance. Every almost sentence. Every moment that lingered too long. Bryce frowned slightly. Dawson. I realized I'd been staring. Yeah, I said too quickly. Still looking. He nodded slowly, but his eyes stayed on me for an extra second like he knew something was off. Then he sat beside me on the bed close enough that our shoulders brushed lightly. Usually that wouldn't have affected me. This time it nearly killed me. Because now I knew. Or at least, I thought I did. And the terrifying part wasn't realizing Bryce might be in love with me. It was realizing he thought I'd leave if he ever told me. I barely slept that night. Bryce fell asleep beside me around 2 in the morning like nothing had changed, stretched across the bed with one arm hanging off the mattress and his breathing slow and steady. Meanwhile, I stared at the ceiling feeling like my entire life had been rearranged while I wasn't paying attention. 6 years. The number kept replaying in my head. Not because I doubted what I saw, because I understood it too well. I kept thinking back through every year we'd known each other, trying to figure out how I missed something this big. But the more memories I replayed, the worse it got. Because suddenly, I hadn't missed it at all. I'd ignored it. There's a difference. Like sophomore year, when Bryce got drunk at a Halloween party and spent 20 straight minutes arguing with some guy who wouldn't stop flirting with me. At the time, I thought he was just being protective. But afterward, while we walked back to campus alone, Bryce had gone weirdly quiet. "You know he was into you, right?" he asked suddenly. I laughed. "Who?" "The guy dressed like Spider-Man." "You're jealous of Spider-Man?" "I'm serious." Something in his voice made me glance over. Bryce was staring straight ahead with his hands shoved into his hoodie pockets. Then he looked at me and smiled suddenly, easy and relaxed again. Forget it. I did forget it. Until now. Or the time during senior year when I dated this guy named Ethan for about 3 months. Bryce hated him instantly. Not openly. Bryce was too careful for that. But every time Ethan came around, Bryce got quieter, sharper around the edges. And the night Ethan and I broke up, Bryce showed up at my apartment 30 minutes later carrying takeout and beer like he already knew. "How'd you know?" I asked. Bryce shrugged. "You sounded sad on the phone." I remember staring at him back then too. Because nobody else ever noticed when I sounded sad. Only Bryce. Always Bryce. Around 4:30 in the morning, I rolled onto my side and looked at him sleeping beside me. God, how did I not see this? Bryce shifted slightly in his sleep, brows pulling together for a second before relaxing again. And something painful hit me right then. He really thought I'd leave. That part kept hurting the most. Not the feelings. Not the secret. The fear. Because Bryce wasn't scared of rejection in those messages. He was scared of losing me entirely. Which meant he'd probably convinced himself staying silent was safer. I understood that feeling more than I wanted to admit. The next morning was unbearable. Bryce woke up first like he usually did. By the time I dragged myself into the kitchen, he was already making coffee while music played softly from his phone. "Morning," he said casually. Too casually. I wondered if he had any idea I knew. "Morning." He glanced over his shoulder. "You look terrible." "Thanks." "You sleep at all?" "Not really, no." I spent the entire night realizing I'm in love with my best friend who's apparently in love with me too. Instead, I just shrugged. Kinda. Bryce studied me for a second too long. That was another thing I suddenly noticed now how carefully he watched me all the time. Like checking for damage. "You okay?" he asked. There it was again. Soft voice. Quiet concern. Bryce only sounded like that with me. And now that I knew, I couldn't unhear it. "Yeah," I said quickly. "Why?" He leaned back against the counter slightly, coffee mug in hand. "I don't know," he admitted. "You're acting weird." My stomach flipped violently. Because technically, I was the one hiding something now. The irony almost made me laugh. Bryce walked closer and lightly bumped his shoulder against mine. "You sure?" That tiny touch felt catastrophic suddenly. I stepped away too fast. Bryce froze immediately. The hurt on his face appeared so quickly it physically punched through me. "Oh," he said quietly. "Shit. No, that's not. It's fine." He looked down at his coffee. "Sorry." And there it was. That fear again. The exact fear from the messages. Like one wrong move would make me disappear. I hated it instantly. "Bryce." He shook his head once, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Seriously, forget it." But I couldn't. The whole day felt wrong after that. We had plans already: grocery shopping, lunch downtown, helping Bryce's cousin move furniture later. Normal Saturday stuff we'd done together 100 times before. Except now every interaction felt loaded. Every glance lingered too long. Every silence meant something. At the grocery store, Bryce reached automatically for my card while we moved through the parking lot together. Something stupid and tiny. But then I remembered the messages again. Then he smiles at me, and I'm screwed again. I nearly walked directly into a parked car. "You good?" Bryce asked immediately. "Yeah." "You sure?" "Bryce," I laughed nervously. "You ask me that like every 12 minutes. His expression softened a little. "Because you never tell me when something's wrong." The terrifying part was, he was right. I looked away first. Later, while we helped his cousin move boxes into a new apartment, Bryce climbed onto the back of the truck to hand things down to me. At one point, he reached for my wrist to steady me when I nearly lost balance stepping off the curb. The contact lasted maybe 2 seconds. Still felt electric. Bryce noticed too. I knew he did because he let go immediately afterward like he burned himself. And for the rest of the afternoon, he barely touched me at all. No casual shoulder bumps. No grabbing my hoodie sleeve. No absent-minded leaning against me while we talked. Nothing. By evening, the distance between us felt enormous. Which was ridiculous considering we were sitting 3 feet apart on his couch, watching a movie neither of us was paying attention to. Bryce kept scrolling his phone during quiet scenes. Probably texting that same number. The thought bothered me more than it should have. I tried ignoring it. Failed completely. Finally, Bryce sighed softly and locked his phone. "Okay," he said. "What did I do?" I blinked. "What? You've been acting strange all day." He looked genuinely worried now. Did something happen? My pulse started climbing immediately. This was it. I could tell him right now. I could say, "I saw the messages. I know. And I love you too." But fear hit me just as fast. Because what if I misunderstood everything somehow? What if Bryce panicked? What if saying it out loud ruined the one relationship in my life that mattered most? Bryce leaned forward slightly. "Dawson." God, even hearing my name in his voice hurt now. "I didn't do something, did I?" he asked quietly. The vulnerability in that question almost broke me. Because Bryce sounded genuinely terrified of the answer. And suddenly I realized something awful. He'd probably been living like this for years. Constantly checking himself. Constantly scared he'd say too much. Feel too much. Want too much. All while standing right beside me. I swallowed hard. "No," I said softly. "You didn't do anything." Bryce held my gaze for a long second. Then he nodded once. But he didn't look convinced. Bryce started avoiding being alone with me after that. Not obviously. That was the worst part. If he'd suddenly become cold or distant, maybe it would have been easier to deal with. But Bryce still acted like Bryce still texted me memes at 2 in the morning, still stole fries off my plate when we went out to eat, still showed up at my apartment without knocking because apparently personal boundaries didn't exist between us anymore. Except now there was hesitation underneath everything. Tiny pauses. Careful distance. Like he sensed something had shifted and didn't know whether to run from it or protect it. And honestly, same. 3 days after I found the messages, Bryce canceled our movie night for the first time in months. His text came around 7. "Bryce, gonna stay home tonight, I think." Long day. I stared at it for way too long. Normally, he would have just come over anyway. Bryce treated exhaustion like a personality trait. Me. "Everything okay?" The typing bubble appeared immediately. Bryce. "Yeah, just tired." Lie. I knew Bryce's lies by now. They always got shorter. Me. "Did I do something?" That took longer to answer. Bryce. "What?" "No." Me. "You've been weird with me." Another pause. Bryce. "Thought maybe you wanted space." My chest tightened instantly. Because of the kitchen. Because I stepped away from him. God. Before I could overthink it, I grabbed my keys and drove to his apartment. Bryce opened the door wearing sweatpants and an old black hoodie I stole constantly because it smelled like him. His expression shifted immediately when he saw me. "Dawson, you're avoiding me." Straight to the point. No energy left for subtlety. Bryce looked caught off guard for half a second before stepping aside to let me in. "I'm not avoiding you. You canceled movie night. You say that like we're divorcing." I laughed despite myself. Bryce smiled a little too, but it faded quickly. The apartment felt quieter than usual. No music playing. No TV noise in the background. Just us standing awkwardly in the kitchen like strangers pretending not to know each other too well. Bryce crossed his arms. "Okay, what's going on?" There it was again. That question. And suddenly I realized Bryce had been asking me versions of it for days. "You okay? Did I do something? You seem off." Because Bryce noticed everything about me. Always had. I looked at him for a long moment before speaking. "Why did you think I wanted space?" His face changed instantly. Not dramatically. Just enough. Fear. Recognition. Then careful neutrality sliding back into place. "You pulled away," he said quietly. "In the kitchen?" "Yeah." I swallowed hard. "That wasn't because I didn't want you near me." Bryce looked down immediately after I said it. Like he physically couldn't handle hearing that. My pulse was going insane now. I took a slow breath. "Bryce, I said carefully. Can I ask you something? He nodded once. When's the last time you dated someone you actually liked? His eyes flicked up to mine immediately. What? You heard me. Bryce gave a nervous laugh. What kind of question is that? The kind I'm asking. Silence. Then he leaned back against the counter and rubbed a hand over his face. Probably sophomore year. That long? Yeah. Why? Bryce looked exhausted suddenly. Because it's easier not to. There it was. Not confirmation exactly, but close enough that my chest hurt. I stepped closer before I could stop myself. Bryce noticed immediately. I saw it in the way his breathing changed. Dawson. Soft warning. I ignored it. Why are you scared of losing me? The room went completely still. Bryce stared at me. Actually stared. And for one horrible second, I thought maybe I'd pushed too far. Then he looked away sharply. I don't know what you're talking about. Lie again. Short answer. Bryce only lied like that when he panicked. Yes, you do. His jaw tightened. No, he said quietly. I really don't think I do. I should have stopped. Instead, I said the worst possible thing. I saw the messages. Bryce froze. Completely. I watched the exact moment his entire body went cold. What? His voice barely sounded like him. The other night, I admitted quickly. On your laptop. The notification popped up, and I clicked it before I realized what it was, and Jesus Christ. Bryce stepped backward like I hit him. Instantly, I regretted everything. I wasn't trying to snoop. You read them? The look on his face destroyed me. Not anger. Humiliation. Pure humiliation. Bryce. How much? My throat tightened. Enough. He laughed once under his breath, except it sounded awful. Hollow. Then he turned away from me completely. I should go, I said immediately. No, Bryce snapped. I stopped. He stood with both hands braced against the kitchen counter, head lowered slightly. I'd never seen him look like this before. Small. Bryce always made himself look bigger than whatever he felt. Louder. More relaxed. Untouchable. Now he just looked exposed. I knew this would happen, he said quietly. The sadness in his voice physically hurt. Bryce. I knew eventually I'd screw this up somehow. You didn't screw anything up. He laughed again bitterly. Dawson, you just found out I've been secretly in love with you for years. Pretty sure that qualifies. Hearing him actually say it out loud stole every thought from my head. Bryce finally turned toward me again. His eyes looked miserable. I'm sorry. What? I never wanted you to feel weird around me. His voice shook slightly now. I tried really hard not to let it become your problem. My chest ached so badly I could barely breathe. Because even now, even standing here completely shattered open, Bryce was still more worried about making me uncomfortable than protecting himself. I don't feel weird around you, I said softly. Bryce looked at me like he didn't believe that for a second. You should probably go home, he said quietly. No. His brows pulled together slightly. No, I'm not leaving like this. Dawson. No, Bryce. My voice cracked a little. Stop deciding what I feel before I even say it. That got his attention. He stared at me silently. Then finally, what exactly are you trying to say? God. My heart was pounding so hard it felt painful now. Because this was the point where everything changed. One direction or the other. I took a shaky breath, then stepped closer again until there was barely any space left between us. Bryce looked stunned by that alone. I didn't pull away in the kitchen because I didn't want you touching me, I said quietly. His breathing stopped. I pulled away because suddenly I realized why it affected me so much. Bryce's eyes searched mine desperately now like he was trying to figure out if this was real or some kind of cruel misunderstanding. Dawson, I think, I admitted softly. I've been in love with you for a really long time, too. Complete silence. Bryce just stared at me. No reaction. No movement. Honestly, that scared me more. Then finally he laughed once under his breath. Not amused. Disbelieving. You're serious? Yeah. You're actually serious. Yes, Bryce. His eyes looked glassy suddenly. And that terrified me because Bryce almost never cried. I'd seen him emotional maybe twice in 6 years. You read those messages, he said quietly. And you still came here? I swallowed hard. Yeah. Bryce looked away immediately like he couldn't handle hearing that either. Then after a long silence, he whispered the saddest thing I'd ever heard in my life. I spent 6 years trying not to ruin this. The way Bryce said it nearly broke me. Not dramatic. Not angry. Just tired. Like he'd spent years carrying something too heavy alone. I spent 6 years trying not to ruin this. I looked at him standing there in his kitchen, shoulders tense, eyes shining slightly under the warm apartment lights, and suddenly every moment between us rearranged itself completely. All those times Bryce almost said something and stopped himself. All the relationships that never lasted. All the careful distance whenever things between us started feeling too close. He wasn't scared of his feelings. He was scared of losing me. And somehow that hurt more than anything else. Bryce, I said quietly, you didn't ruin anything. He looked at me like he wanted to believe that, but didn't know how. You have no idea how many times I almost told you, he admitted softly. My chest tightened. How many? Bryce laughed weakly. Too many. Then after a second, senior year almost killed me. That surprised me. What happened senior year? He looked embarrassed immediately. You dated Ethan. Oh, yeah, Bryce muttered. Oh, despite everything, I smiled slightly. You hated him. I absolutely hated him. You said he looked like he moisturized too much. He did. I laughed before I could stop myself. Bryce stared at me for a second after that laugh, like hearing it physically relieved him. God. He looked so scared this entire conversation. Not of rejection anymore. Of hope. Like letting himself believe this was real felt dangerous. I stepped closer carefully. Bryce didn't move away this time. You know what's insane? I admitted quietly. What? I thought I was hiding this really well. That made him blink. What? My feelings. Bryce stared at me, then actually smiled a little for the first time since I arrived. Dawson, he said softly, you are terrible at hiding things from me. I frowned immediately. Excuse you. You literally stop making eye contact when you're emotional. That is not true. It absolutely is. I hate this conversation. Bryce laughed quietly. And just like that, something shifted. The tension was still there. The fear too. But underneath it now was recognition. Like we were finally standing in the same reality instead of dancing around different versions of it. Bryce rubbed both hands over his face slowly before looking at me again. I genuinely don't know what to do right now. Same. I had this whole thing planned in my head where if you ever found out, I'd deny everything and move to another country. I snorted. That was the plan. It was evolving. I laughed again. Bryce's expression softened instantly hearing it. Then suddenly he looked serious again. Wait. What? You're not messing with me? My heart cracked a little at that question. Because he sounded completely sincere. Bryce. I'm serious, he said quickly. Because honestly this feels statistically impossible. I moved before I could overthink it. 1 second there was space between us. The next, I grabbed the front of his hoodie lightly and pulled him toward me. Bryce froze immediately. Not pulling away. Not breathing either, apparently. I could feel his heartbeat from this close. Fast. Unsteady. Just like mine. You're an idiot, I whispered softly. Bryce stared at me. And God, I'd never seen him look at me like this before. Not guarded. Not careful. Just open. Completely open. You have no idea, he admitted quietly. My eyes dropped briefly to his mouth before I could stop myself. Bryce noticed. Of course he noticed. He always noticed everything about me. The air between us changed instantly. Neither of us moved. Dawson, Bryce said softly, and the sound of my name in his voice nearly destroyed my ability to think. Yeah. You're really here right now? I nodded once. That seemed to undo him more than anything else. Bryce closed his eyes briefly like he was trying to steady himself. Then finally he admitted the truth I think we both already knew. I've wanted to kiss you for years. The honesty in it hit me hard. Not because it shocked me anymore. Because of how long he kept it buried. 6 years of wanting something and convincing yourself you could never have it. I don't know who moved first. Maybe both of us. But suddenly Bryce's forehead rested lightly against mine, and his hands were gripping the sides of my hoodie like he needed grounding. Neither of us spoke. We just stood there breathing the same air for a long second that somehow felt bigger than every year before it. Then Bryce kissed me. Softly. Carefully. Like he still wasn't entirely convinced I was real. And honestly, I understood. Because kissing Bryce felt strange in the exact opposite way I expected. Not unfamiliar. Familiar. Like something my body already knew before my brain caught up. Bryce made this quiet sound against my mouth that nearly ended me emotionally right there in his kitchen. When we pulled apart slightly, he looked overwhelmed. Actually overwhelmed. You okay? I whispered. Bryce laughed shakily. No, not even remotely. That made me smile immediately. Then his expression changed suddenly. Fear again. What? I asked. You can still change your mind. I blinked. Bryce. I'm serious. His voice got quieter. I know this is a lot all at once. The fact that he was still preparing himself for rejection even now hurt more than anything else tonight. I reached for his hand automatically. Bryce looked down at it like the contact alone meant something enormous. I'm not changing my mind, I said softly. He swallowed hard. Then finally, okay, just okay. But the way he said it sounded like relief after years underwater. We ended up on the couch eventually because apparently neither of us trusted our legs anymore. Bryce sat beside me unusually quiet, one knee pressed lightly against mine. Not hiding anymore. That tiny detail alone felt surreal. I can't believe you saw the messages, he muttered eventually, covering his face with one hand. I laughed softly. Yeah, that part's unfortunate. I'm gonna think about that at 4 in the morning for the rest of my life. You literally confessed your love in those texts. I know, he groaned. Horrifying. I nudged his shoulder gently. Bryce looked at me over his hand. Then, after a long second, his expression softened again into something almost vulnerable. You really felt the same way? The fact that he still needed reassurance made my chest ache. Yes. For how long? I hesitated. Bryce immediately pointed at me accusingly. Oh my God. It's been years for you too, hasn't it? Maybe. Dawson. Okay, fine. Since sophomore year. Bryce stared at me in complete disbelief. Then he dropped his head back against the couch dramatically. We are actually the dumbest people alive. We are actually the dumbest people alive. Bryce sounded personally offended by it. I laughed so hard I nearly fell sideways into him. And for the first time all week, everything stopped feeling terrifying for a second. Bryce looked at me with this soft disbelief that still hadn't left his face since I confessed. You mean to tell me, he said slowly, that I spent 6 years emotionally suffering for no reason? It wasn't no reason. Yes, it was. You were literally in love with me too. I didn't know you liked me. Bryce pointed dramatically. I rearranged my entire schedule around you. You do that for everybody. No, I don't. You drove 40 minutes at midnight once because I said I was craving fries. Exactly. That's friendship. That is absolutely not friendship. I laughed again. God. Hearing Bryce openly talk like this felt surreal. No more carefully worded sentences. No more hiding inside jokes behind irony. Just honesty. And apparently Bryce had years' worth of honesty backed up waiting to ruin both our emotional stability. You know what the worst part is? He muttered. What? You dated people right in front of me. I blinked. Bryce, you dated people right in front of me too. Yeah, but mine were distractions. That shut me up immediately. Because he sounded so sincere saying it. Bryce looked down at his hands quietly for a second before continuing. I'd meet someone and think maybe this time it'll finally go away. He laughed weakly. Then you'd text me something stupid like Kane's chicken tonight? And suddenly I didn't care about anybody else again. My chest physically hurt listening to him. How did you survive this long? I asked softly. I didn't, Bryce admitted. I just got really good at pretending. Silence settled between us after that. Not awkward. Heavy. The kind filled with too many years of things unsaid. Bryce leaned back against the couch cushion slowly, eyes fixed on the ceiling. I seriously thought if you ever found out, you'd stop looking at me the same way. I moved closer before I even realized I was doing it. Bryce immediately looked over at me. I am looking at you differently, I admitted quietly. His expression fell instantly. Then I smiled slightly. Mostly because now everything makes sense. Bryce stared at me carefully. What does that mean? It means, I said softly, I spent years thinking I imagined things between us. His eyes flickered slightly. Like what? I laughed under my breath. Bryce. No, seriously. I hesitated. Then finally, the way you always looked at me. He went still immediately. I knew it wasn't normal. I continued quietly. I just convinced myself I was reading into it. Bryce looked almost embarrassed suddenly. I tried really hard not to. That's the thing, I said. I don't think you did. He blinked. What? You hid the words, I explained softly. Not the feeling. That hit him hard. I could tell. Because Bryce looked away instantly like he needed a second to recover from hearing that out loud. You noticed? He asked quietly. Bryce, you looked at me like I was your entire personality. He covered his face with both hands immediately. Oh my God. I laughed helplessly. This is so humiliating. No, I said gently. It's not. But he still looked overwhelmed. After a second, Bryce lowered his hands and looked at me again carefully. You know what's weird? What? I thought if this ever happened, everything would feel different. And He held my gaze for a long second. It still just feels like you. God. That one sentence nearly destroyed me more than the confession itself. Because he was right. This didn't feel like becoming strangers. It felt like finally understanding what we already were. Bryce shifted closer slowly until our knees pressed together fully now. Neither of us moved away. I'm kinda scared, he admitted suddenly. I blinked. Of what? This being temporary. The vulnerability in his voice made my chest ache again. Bryce. I mean it, he said quickly. What if this gets weird and ruins everything? What if we're better as friends and we just screwed up the best thing in our lives because we got emotional for 5 minutes? There it was. The real fear underneath everything. Not rejection anymore. Losing us. I reached for his hand again instinctively. Bryce intertwined our fingers immediately this time like reflex. I don't think this happened because we got emotional for 5 minutes, I said softly. His eyes dropped briefly to our hands. Then back to me. You really believe that? Yes. Bryce studied my face carefully like he was searching for hesitation. Apparently finding none relaxed him slightly. Then after a long silence, he smiled weakly. You know what actually pisses me off? What? We could have been doing this years ago. I laughed immediately. Whose fault is that? Yours probably. Excuse you? You're emotionally repressed. You wrote secret love confessions to an unknown number. That was therapy. I stared at him. Bryce stared back. Then finally he admitted. It was not therapy. I laughed so hard I accidentally leaned into him completely. Bryce caught me automatically, one arm wrapping around my shoulders without hesitation. And suddenly we both went quiet. Because this was different now. Not because the contact changed. Because now we understood it. Bryce looked down at me carefully. You okay? The soft way he asked that nearly killed me all over again. Except now I could finally answer honestly. Yeah, I whispered. His expression warmed immediately hearing that. Then he said something so quiet I almost missed it. I can't believe I get to do this. My throat tightened instantly. Bryce. No, seriously, he said, voice still soft. Do you understand how long I convinced myself this would never happen? I looked at him for a second before answering. Probably about as long as I did. That made him smile slowly. Then after a pause. So what now? Good question. Neither of us had prepared for success apparently. I looked around his apartment helplessly. Honestly, I feel like we should win an award for surviving 6 years of mutual stupidity. Bryce snorted. Then his expression softened again into something quieter. You staying tonight? The question settled warmly in my chest immediately. Not because it was unusual, because it wasn't. I stayed at Bryce's apartment constantly over the years. Shared blankets during movie nights. Fell asleep beside each other after drinking too much. Spent entire weekends existing in the same space comfortably. But now the question meant something else. Bryce noticed my hesitation immediately and panicked. Only if you want, he added quickly. I didn't mean. I want to. He stopped talking instantly. Then smiled. Small. Relieved. Real. God, I loved him. And somehow, unbelievably, Bryce loved me too. I did stay. Not because anything dramatic happened. Honestly, that was the strangest part of the whole night. After 6 years of tension, hidden feelings, and emotional suffering apparently worthy of its own documentary, Bryce and I ended up doing something painfully normal. We ordered bad takeout at 1 in the morning and sat shoulder to shoulder on the couch arguing about what movie to put on. That one's depressing, Bryce complained. You cried at Toy Story 3. That was emotional manipulation. I laughed softly. Bryce glanced over immediately when he heard it. Like he still couldn't believe he was allowed to make me laugh like this now without pretending it meant nothing. Every few minutes I caught him staring. Not subtly either. Just openly looking at me with this quiet disbelief that made my chest feel warm and painful at the same time. Finally, I pointed at him accusingly. You have to stop doing that. Bryce blinked innocently. Doing what? The staring thing. His mouth twitched slightly. Can't help it. You absolutely can. I really can't. God. The honesty still caught me off guard every time. Bryce leaned back deeper into the couch cushions, one arm stretched behind me comfortably. You know what's weird? He said quietly. What? I feel calmer now. That surprised me. Really? Yeah. He looked down briefly. I thought I'd panic if this ever became real. And Bryce looked at me for a long second. I think hiding it was actually the exhausting part. That hit me harder than he probably realized. Because I understood it instantly. The relief of finally stopping. Stopping the pretending. stopping the careful distance, stopping the constant self-monitoring every time the other person smiled at you. Bryce rubbed his thumb absently against the couch fabric beside my arm. Then quietly, I almost told you sophomore year. I turned toward him immediately. What? Yeah. What happened? Bryce laughed weakly. You wore that stupid green hoodie all the time. I stared at him. That's your explanation? You looked good in it, he said simply. My heart actually skipped. Bryce noticed immediately and smiled slightly. That reaction right there is exactly why I never survived this emotionally. I shoved his shoulder lightly. You're ridiculous. You like me in the green hoodie? You breathed near me, and I liked it. I stared at him in complete disbelief. Bryce shrugged helplessly. I had a hard 6 years, Dawson. I laughed so suddenly I nearly choked on my drink. Bryce grinned at me for a second before his expression softened again. Then quietly, you really had no idea? I hesitated. Not consciously, I admitted. What does that mean? It means I looked down at my hands. I think some part of me knew something was different about us. I just didn't let myself think too hard about it. Bryce nodded slowly like that made perfect sense to him. Because of course it did. He'd been doing the exact same thing. The movie played forgotten in the background while we kept talking. About everything. Or maybe more accurately, all the things we'd carefully avoided talking about for years. Like why Bryce always got weird whenever I dated someone seriously. Or why I hated every girl Bryce brought around, even when they were perfectly nice. Or why neither of us ever really tried building lives that didn't automatically include the other person. At some point, Bryce got quieter. I looked over and found him already watching me again. What? He smiled softly. Nothing. Bryce. I'm just thinking. Dangerous. He laughed under his breath. Then after a second, I almost lost my mind when you dated Ethan. There it is again. What? The Ethan hatred. Bryce groaned dramatically. Dawson, he once called you buddy. I frowned. Okay. You are not a buddy. I stared at him. Bryce stared back. Then finally, I was jealous and deeply annoying. I know. I laughed helplessly. God, hearing Bryce openly admit things like this felt unreal. Like unlocking years of hidden context all at once. You know what I think is funny? I said eventually. What? I genuinely thought you were the emotionally stable one between us. Bryce looked horrified. Absolutely not. You always seemed so calm. That was performance anxiety. I laughed again. Bryce smiled, watching me for a second before his expression softened into something more serious. Can I ask you something? Yeah. When did you realize? I knew immediately what he meant. Not when I found the messages. Before that, I thought about it honestly. Then sighed softly. Second year, I admitted. Bryce went very still. What happened? There was this night after finals, I said quietly. We were sitting on the dorm roof talking about random stuff, and you fell asleep on my shoulder. Bryce blinked slowly. I remember that. Yeah. I smiled weakly. And I remember realizing I didn't want to move because it felt too important somehow. His expression changed immediately hearing that. Softened. Opened. I went back to my room afterward. I continued quietly. And had a complete identity crisis for like 3 days. Bryce laughed softly under his breath. Then after a second. You know what I remember about that night? What? You kept checking if I was cold. My chest tightened. You noticed? Dawson. He smiled sadly. I noticed everything about you. God. That sentence settled somewhere deep inside me and stayed there. The apartment got quieter after that. Not awkward quiet. Comfortable. The kind that only exists between people who already know each other too well. Bryce shifted closer beside me slowly until his shoulder rested fully against mine now. No hesitation anymore. I turned slightly toward him. He looked tired suddenly. Emotionally tired. Like years of holding himself together were finally catching up to him. You okay? I asked softly. Bryce nodded once. Then after a long pause, he admitted the truth anyway. I think I'm still waiting for this to disappear tomorrow. My chest ached immediately. I reached for his hand without thinking. Bryce intertwined our fingers instantly. It won't, I said quietly. He looked at me carefully. You promise? The vulnerability in that question nearly wrecked me completely. And suddenly I understood something terrifying. Bryce trusted me with his feelings now. Completely. Which meant I had the power to hurt him in ways nobody else ever could. The realization felt enormous. I squeezed his hand gently. I promise, I whispered. Bryce looked at me for a long second after that. Then finally, quietly. Okay. And for the first time since finding the messages, he sounded like he actually believed me. The next morning felt strangely normal. That terrified me more than anything else. I woke up tangled halfway under Bryce's blanket with sunlight pouring through the apartment windows and the smell of coffee already drifting in from the kitchen. For a second, I forgot everything. Then I remembered. The messages, the confession, the fact that Bryce kissed me like he'd been waiting years to do it. My stomach flipped instantly. Not panic, something warmer. I dragged myself out to the kitchen still half asleep and found Bryce standing barefoot by the counter making coffee in an old gray t-shirt. He looked up immediately when he heard me. And then something happened that had never happened before. Bryce looked openly happy to see me, not hiding it behind sarcasm, not pretending to be casual, just happy. "Morning," he said softly. God, that voice again. I leaned against the kitchen doorway watching him for a second. Bryce noticed immediately and smiled slightly. "Why are you looking at me like that?" I think my brain's still catching up. Mine too. He handed me a coffee mug automatically before I even asked. Another thing he always did. Another thing suddenly full of new meaning. "You sleep okay?" he asked. Eventually. Bryce nodded like he understood exactly why. Silence settled between us for a second. Comfortable. Then Bryce looked down at his coffee and laughed quietly to himself. "What? I just realized I can flirt with you now." I nearly choked. Bryce looked deeply pleased with himself after that reaction. "Oh, this is going to be fun. You're unbearable already. You like it?" Unfortunately, he sounded extremely confident about that. And honestly, that confidence looked good on him. Just relieved. Like years of restraint had finally loosened. Bryce walked closer slowly until he stood directly in front of me, coffee mug still warm between my hands. Then quietly, "Still real?" My chest tightened instantly. Because underneath the teasing, there it was again. That fear. The part of Bryce still waiting for this to vanish. I set my coffee down and grabbed the front of his shirt lightly. "Still real," I promised. The look on his face after that nearly ruined me emotionally before breakfast. Bryce leaned forward slowly, resting his forehead briefly against mine. "You know what's embarrassing?" he murmured. "What?" I had entire speeches planned. I laughed softly. "For confessing?" "Yes." "How dramatic were they?" Bryce looked offended. "Extremely. I'm devastated I missed them." "You should be." I smiled helplessly. Then Bryce kissed me again. Soft. Sleepy. Careful in that way that still felt almost unbelievable after all these years. When he pulled back, he looked calmer than I'd seen him in days. Maybe years. And suddenly I realized something. Bryce had probably spent so long preparing himself for heartbreak that he never imagined what relief would feel like instead. Around noon, we ended up walking downtown together because apparently neither of us knew how to sit still anymore. The city felt different somehow. Or maybe I did. Bryce walked beside me close enough that our shoulders kept brushing accidentally on purpose. Neither of us mentioned it. At one crosswalk, Bryce reached automatically for my sleeve to pull me back from a cyclist speeding past. His hand lingered for half a second afterward. Then he looked at me carefully, like he was checking if public closeness changed anything. I understood immediately. So instead of stepping away, I grabbed his wrist lightly and kept walking. Bryce went completely silent beside me. I glanced over. He looked stunned. "What? You did that so casually." I blinked. "Bryce, we've literally shared hoodies before. That was emotionally different." I laughed loudly enough that people turned to stare briefly. Bryce grinned, watching me. And there it was again. That look. Except now I finally understood what I'd been seeing all these years. Not friendship alone. Not hidden longing either. Recognition. Like every time Bryce looked at me, part of him was quietly thinking, "There you are." We stopped for lunch at this tiny diner we always went to after late classes in college. Same booths. Same terrible menus. Bryce slid into the seat across from me and stared around the place with this weird, nostalgic expression. "What?" I asked. He smiled softly. "I used to sit here and think about kissing you." I nearly dropped my menu. Bryce looked very satisfied with himself. "You can't just say things like that randomly. I've been suppressing them for years. They're escaping now. You're a menace." "Correct." I shook my head laughing. But underneath the laughter, emotion kept catching me off guard. Because every tiny thing between us suddenly felt heartbreakingly meaningful now. Not because it changed overnight. Because it had always been there. We were halfway through lunch when Bryce got quieter suddenly. I noticed immediately. "What happened?" He hesitated before answering. "My mom called this morning." "Oh, she wants us to come to dinner Friday." "Us." Not unusual wording. Bryce's family had included me in things for years. But now he looked nervous saying it. You don't want me there? No, I do. He rubbed the back of his neck slightly. I'm just thinking. About. Bryce met my eyes. How long until this stops being just ours? The question settled heavily between us. Because eventually people would notice. Actually notice. The way Bryce looked at me. The way I looked back. The fact that 6 years of unresolved tension apparently disappeared overnight into something painfully obvious. You scared? I asked softly. Bryce thought about it honestly, then nodded once. Yeah, I understood. Not because he was ashamed. Because once something mattered this much, the possibility of losing it became terrifying. I reached across the table instinctively and touched his hand lightly. Bryce looked down at it immediately, then back at me. We don't have to figure out everything today, I said quietly. His shoulders relaxed slightly. You always say the exact right thing. I smiled faintly. No, I don't. You do for me. God. Bryce was going to kill me accidentally someday, just by talking. He intertwined our fingers under the table carefully, like the contact itself grounded him. Then after a second, he smiled softly. You know what's funny? What? I thought finally telling you would make me lose my best friend. I squeezed his hand gently. And instead, Bryce looked at me in that same overwhelming way again. Instead, he smiled, and somehow looked even more in love with me than before. Friday dinner at Bryce's parents' house felt terrifying for absolutely no logical reason. I'd been there hundreds of times before. His mom still texted me separately to remind me to bring leftovers containers because Bryce forgets everything. His dad still called me kid, despite the fact that I was 26 years old. I practically knew where they kept every plate in the kitchen. But now everything felt different. Not externally. Internally. Because Bryce kept looking at me across the car like he was trying to memorize something. You're doing the staring thing again, I muttered while we waited at a red light. Bryce smiled slightly. Still can't help it. You're insane. You like me. Unfortunately, he sounded unbearably smug about that now. I looked out the window to hide my smile. Bryce noticed anyway. Of course he did. You know, he said casually. This would have been useful information literally any time during the last 6 years. Oh, I'm sorry. Next time I realize I'm in love with my best friend, I'll be faster. Bryce laughed loudly enough that I felt warm all over hearing it. God, that sound alone felt like home to me. Dinner itself started normally. Too normally. Bryce's mom hugged both of us immediately when we walked in. There are my boys. Bryce and I exchanged a brief look at the exact same time. His mom narrowed her eyes instantly. Mothers know things. It's genuinely terrifying. You two are acting weird, she announced before we even sat down. Bryce nearly choked on air. We're literally standing here. Exactly, she replied suspiciously. I bit the inside of my cheek hard to stop smiling. Bryce kicked my foot lightly under the table during dinner when I kept accidentally staring at him. That alone almost made me laugh out loud because suddenly I understood why his mom kept watching us strangely. We were being obvious. Not dramatically, just differently. Softer around each other. Closer somehow. At one point, Bryce reached automatically for my drink when I almost knocked it over beside my plate. His hand stayed there half a second too long. His mom noticed immediately. I knew because her eyebrows shot upward so fast, it was almost impressive. Bryce noticed her noticing. Instant panic. Mom, he warned. She looked delighted. Oh my God, Mom. His dad looked between us slowly. Then smiled. Actually smiled. And suddenly Bryce looked horrified. You told him before me? He asked his mother accusingly. She gasped dramatically. I told nobody anything. You absolutely gave him a look. There was no look. There was a huge look. I laughed helplessly beside him while Bryce spiraled in real time. Then his dad said the calmest sentence imaginable. Bryce, you've looked at Dawson like that since college. Complete silence. Bryce froze. I froze. His mother looked deeply vindicated. I knew it, she yelled immediately. Bryce covered his face with both hands. This is my nightmare. No, his mom corrected happily. This is adorable. I was laughing too hard to help him at this point. Bryce looked at me through his fingers dramatically. You were supposed to be emotionally supporting me. I physically can't breathe right now. His dad looked genuinely confused. Wait, you two thought you were subtle? Bryce made the saddest sound I've ever heard another human being make. And somehow that completely shattered the remaining tension in the room. Because suddenly we weren't hiding anymore. Not strategically revealing things. Not carefully preparing everyone. Just existing honestly. Bryce's mom hugged us both again after dinner, while Bryce looked emotionally exhausted from surviving parental awareness. "I'm happy for you boys," she said softly. And the sincerity in her voice hit me harder than I expected. Because Bryce relaxed immediately hearing it, like some tiny guarded part of him finally unclenched. Later that night, Bryce and I ended up back at his apartment sitting on the floor beside the couch because neither of us had energy left to function like normal adults anymore. Bryce leaned his head back dramatically against the couch cushion. "I can never return to that house." I laughed softly. Your mother literally looked thrilled. She called us soulmates with her eyes. That's not a real thing. It absolutely is. I nudged his shoulder gently. Bryce looked over at me quietly after that. The joking faded slowly from his expression. "What?" I asked softly. He shook his head once. Then after a second, "I think this is the happiest I've ever been." My chest tightened instantly. Not because he sounded dramatic, because he sounded surprised. Like happiness this complete genuinely hadn't occurred to him before. I moved closer automatically until our shoulders rested together. Bryce reached for my hand immediately. "Easy now. Natural. No hesitation left." "You know what's funny?" I murmured. "What?" "We spent years thinking this would destroy everything." Bryce looked at me softly. "Yeah. And instead," he smiled slowly. "Instead, he leaned forward and kissed me gently like it was the simplest thing in the world." And maybe that was the whole point. What Bryce and I had never started the night I found the messages, or sophomore year, or on that dorm rooftop, or during all the years we spent orbiting each other pretending not to notice the gravity between us. It started long before that. In every tiny moment we chose each other without realizing. Every late-night phone call. Every instinct to reach for the other first. Every look that lasted too long. We were never really becoming something new. We were finally allowing ourselves to be what we already were. And the strangest part? After all the fear, all the waiting, all the years we wasted terrified of ruining us, loving Bryce felt easy. Like coming home after being lost longer than you realized.